Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Prashant Muntani, and I'm here to talk about working with rasters and imagery using the ArcGIS Pro SDK for .NET. Can everyone hear me at the back? Everybody good? Perfect. So before we get started, I just wanted to get a sense of the room. Can you, by show of hands, let me know if you've used ArcGIS Pro already? Great. And what about the Pro SDK for .NET? Great. Good enough. So. In the interest of time, I won't be spending too much time on the basics of Pro or the basics of creating an add-in, but you should be able to follow along pretty well even if you haven't played around with the Pro SDK. So let's get started. So when you're working with rasters and imagery in the Pro SDK, you can divide the functionality up into two logical sections. The first section can be thought of as visualizing raster data, like adding it to the map and controlling how it's displayed or rendered. And the second section can be thought of as working with raster data, actual access to pixels and properties. So we'll be going through those two sections where I'll be describing some of the main functionality that you can work with using the SDK. Next, we'll take a look at a demo of an add-in, which is already published as one of our samples, which will basically use parts of both of these sections of the SDK. I'll give you some information about where to find more information about the imagery and raster sections of the Pro SDK. I'll summarize and then I'll take questions. So when you think about visualizing raster data, the first thing that comes to mind if you're using any of our desktop software, either ArcMap or Pro, is adding the data to a map. The very action of adding the data to a map actually creates a layer in the table of contents or in the map for you to work with. So when we started implementing the SDK, that's the first thing we did as well. We implemented the ability to create a layer from your raster data. So Pro has a layer factory, which allows you to create layers. And when you're dealing with raster data, there's three types of layers that you can create. A raster layer is useful for, is basically used for pointing to imagery, whether it's on disk or it's in a geodatabase. A mosaic layer is generally used to represent a mosaic dataset. If you're not familiar with mosaic datasets, there are a data management model for working with large collections of imagery, where you can not only mosaic this imagery on the fly, but you can also process it, and it also acts as a catalog. So you can publish a raster or a mosaic dataset as a dynamic image service, and that's basically our third type of layer that you can create. So next step, once you have the data in the map, you want to be able to control how it's visualized, right? And so on all the layers, we have the ability to control visualization in the form of colorizers. So you can get and set colorizers on all these layers. These colorizers, if you worked with rasters or imagery in Pro, allow you to basically control how the image is rendered. So you can control everything from the band combination for multispectral data, resampling type, which is the resampling, which is used to do the rendering. You can control how the data is stretched and where you get the statistics from. So we'll talk about colorizers a little bit more in just a second. But also on all layers, you get the ability, you get the access to the source image or the source data that it's coming from. And the get raster method on all layers basically gets you the image that's being used to, the image that's being rendered. We'll talk more about rasters in the raster objects in the next section. For mosaics and image service layers, they can potentially point to a collection of images, and these images are mosaicked on the fly. So we give you additional capabilities to control how these images are mosaicked together and how they're sorted before mosaicing and how the overlap is resolved. So these are called mosaic method and mosaic operator in the SDK. For when you're viewing image services, you may potentially be transferring large amounts of data. So we also give you the ability to get and set compression method and quality, which can make a difference in the performance when you're viewing and working with imagery. Last but not least, you can get and set processing templates. Now, processing templates are basically additional processing you can define and attach to a mosaic dataset or an image service that allow you to process data on the fly in multiple ways. So a good example of this is if you've got a collection or even a single elevation image, a DEM or a DSM, You can basically attach processing templates to the image service that you publish from there, or if you've got a collection, you can attach it to the Mosaic dataset as well, that allow you to visualize your data differently in terms of, let's say, maybe a hill shade or a shaded relief, but also allow you to basically do an aspect calculation or a slope calculation. All these can be processing templates that you can attach to the Mosaic dataset or an image service, and the SDK gives you the ability to get and set those as well. So let's talk a little bit more about colorizers. Now, ArcGIS Pro gives you the ability to visualize your data in multiple ways, right? So this is a screenshot of a dropdown for a typical one-band image without an attribute table. You can actually get, if it's continuous data, you can basically just stretch values along color ramp, which is our default. If you want to combine the data into groups, you can combine it using the classify renderer, which assigns a color for a group of values. Or if you've got enough small unique if you've got a small number of unique values in the data set, you can use the unique value colorizer to colorize your data. Now, when we first implemented access to colorizers, setting up a new colorizer object was pretty tedious because you had to set like 15, 20 properties on it. And we heard complaints about how hard it was to set up. So at Pro 2.0, we added the concept of a colorizer definition, which is basically a simpler representation of a colorizer and contains only the most commonly used properties for the colorizer, which makes it very easy to set up. So you can basically create a colorizer definition, set a couple of properties on it, and either have the system fill in the rest with defaults, or you can customize the rest of the properties once you create a colorizer as well. Once you have a colorizer or a colorizer definition, you can create a new raster layer with that defined colorizer. Now, the system also has the ability to tell you how you can visualize your data, or which of these are applicable for your data. Excuse me. Which of these are applicable for your data? So that is basically the get applicable colorizers method on the layer, which tells you, okay, fine, so you can visualize your data using the stretch, the classify, or the unique values, for example. So this was basically how you can use the Pro SDK to visualize raster data and control how it's being rendered. So what if I want access to actual pixels? What if I want to do more complicated processing? So at Pro 2.0, we introduced what we call core objects to work with raster data. I'm not going to go through all of these, but the idea is you can find all of them in the ArcGIS core data raster workspace. But let's go through some of the main ones. A raster dataset is our main object that's used to represent an image on disk or in a geodatabase. So the SDK allows you the ability to open up an image as a raster dataset. Once you have a raster dataset open, you can then go in and probably the first thing you want to do is check properties. How many bands does it have? What's the bit depth? What's the no data value, etc. So you can get those properties in the form of a raster dataset definition object. You can also think of a raster dataset as a collection of bands. So you can actually extract and work with each individual band using the getBands methods. And each individual band has its own properties as well in the form of a band definition object. So these allow you to basically open an image and get either one or multiple bands from it and view their properties. And in order to basically get access to the pixels and some other functionality, we basically give you methods to create a raster. Now we've seen a create raster method or a get raster method before as well. So what exactly is a raster object? The easiest way to think about a raster object is an in-memory representation of your image, which you can not just read but write to as well. You can change pretty much anything about the raster, such as anything from extents to the number of bands. You can reproject that image, and you also get a little more ability in terms of being able to transform pixels to basically map coordinates and vice versa. That's basically transforming ground coordinates to image coordinates. So you're mapping a point you clicked on a map into a row and column in your image. You can also work with pixels using the pixel block. Now if you worked with pixels before, you realize you probably don't want to load very large imagery directly into memory. So you probably want to read pixels chunk by chunk, or in our case, using a pixel block. So the pixel block object is basically allows you access to an array of pixels and an array of no data, so you can basically tell if your pixel is valid or not. Now once you create a pixel block from your raster object, you also have the ability to read, write, or erase pixel blocks. Now, if you want to iterate through the whole image, you can do all the calculations yourself, figure out when you're at the end of a row, end of a column, etc. Or you can use the create cursor method to basically create a raster cursor with a defined pixel block and iterate through the whole image using the cursor. That way you don't have to do much of the paperwork. So once you've accessed your pixel blocks, change them or process them as you like, you now also have the option to basically save as the image as a new raster, or a new raster dataset rather. So even though there's a few number of objects, the raster object itself gives you so much functionality to work with imagery. So this was the working with raster data section. Since we're at Dev Summit, let's go take a look at some code. So I'm going to demo an add-in. I'm going to start with ArcGIS Pro, show you what that add-in does, and then we'll go take a look at the code behind. So I have an ArcGIS Pro project with a map in it to which I've added an image. Now I want to share this image with a colleague of mine, but for various reasons I want to mask out certain sections of this image. I've created an add-in that implements a map tool called the Mask Raster tool, which allows me to draw a rectangle anywhere on the image and then mask out those pixels from the image. So if I enable the tool, you see my cursor changes. So if I want to mask out, let's say, this building, I can draw a rectangle around it, double click to finish my sketch. And what the tool is doing in the back end right now is it's basically taking my image, making a copy of it, and then masking out the pixels under the rectangle. I also, using the layer API, I just added that image as a new layer to my map, so I can see the masked out pixels, and as a bonus I also turned off the layer below it. So this is basically what the add-in does. It's a map tool that allows me to draw a rectangle, and it masks out pixels in the image that I've selected in the TOC based on the rectangle after creating a copy of it so I don't destroy original data. So let's take a look at the code and see how all this works. So this is the code for the add-in. As I mentioned before, there's already a sample online which you can take a look at. So I have here an add-in, and every add-in comes with a config.daml. And in my daml, all I've basically done is say create a new group on the add-in tab and add a mask raster tool to that group. The tool is basically a map tool. If I go look at the code for the raster tool, in the constructor I have the ability to set some parameters such that, is this a sketch tool? Yes. What type of sketch do I want? In this case I picked rectangle. And the sketch output mode is pretty interesting. It gives you the ability to either pick map or screen. Now map gives me the extents of my geometry in map coordinates or ground coordinates. And the other option is screen, which gives me the extents of my geometry in screen coordinates. In my case, I want map coordinates because I want to convert them to image coordinates in rows and columns. Now once I finish drawing the rectangle on my image, since I'm using the MVVM paradigm, all I'm doing is basically calling a method in my view model with the same geometry. So let's go take a look at this method. My view model essentially contains just two methods. One of them is the one that does all the work, and the other one is a helper method that opens a raster dataset for me given a folder and a name. So as soon as my drawing is complete on my rectangle, this method is called. And what I'm doing is, first I'm doing some checking to see if I do actually have a map view. I do have a layer selected in the TOC, and I'm checking if the first selected layer in the TOC is actually a raster layer. So this is the error checking stuff I do just to make sure that I'm processing the right thing. Now once I know I have all those, I basically have 4 different sections. The first section is getting the actual source raster dataset or source image from my layer. So I get the first selected layer as a raster layer. I call the get raster method that we just saw in the slides to get the input raster. Now the raster actually has a method called get raster dataset, which allows me access to the basic raster dataset, which is technically a raster dataset as well. So that's, now I've just basically gone from the layer API, the visualizing API, into the working with raster dataset API. So first section, just get the source raster dataset from the layer. Next section, I'm going to copy or save a copy of that out into my project folder. So the project gives me access to the project folder path. I'm going to create a new directory called master output in there, and I'm going to write out a new TIFF called masterraster.tiff. In order to use the save as function of the raster, I need a couple of things. I need a output file system data store, which basically is you can think of as a workspace to copy the image to. And optionally, I need a storage definition. The storage definition usually is not needed, but what I'm using it for here is to basically make sure that no pyramids are calculated when I save the copy out. This is because I'm going to change the image after it's saved out. So if I calculate pyramids beforehand, I'll have to recalculate them because I'm changing the original pixels. So this section's basically about saving as a new image using a storage definition and into the project folder. Once I save it out, I'm also using my helper method to reopen that image. And then I'm creating a raster from it, or a full raster from it, so that I can now go in and access and change pixels. So that was the second section of the add-in. The third section is basically converting that geometry I drew on the map to pixel coordinates. Essentially what I'm doing here is calling the map to pixel method on the raster object with the points that convert from ground coordinates and give me rows and columns in my image. So I have a start row and column and an end row and column, and that defines my rectangle of pixels which I want to mask out. Last but not least, now that I have everything ready, I can use the raster object to create a pixel block of the width and height I just calculated. For each band or plane in that pixel block, I'm basically calling the clear function, which clears that pixel block for me. Now I have a pixel block with basically all the values as 0, which I then use the write function or write method to write out at the correct location and refresh the properties of the data set, and I am good to go. So this section is basically doing the actual work, which is calculating a pixel block of a certain size and then setting all the values in it to 0 and then writing it to my raster or my image. And last but not least, after I update my image, I'm going to create a new layer from the new copy of the image that I saved out. And then I'm going to set the original layer that I selected, and I'm going to set the visibility on it to false. So basically what this add-in does is it uses the layer API to get a source image or a source raster dataset from a raster layer that I selected. It then uses a geometry that I drew on the raster, converts the geometry from ground coordinates into actual pixels in my raster, which I then mask out after I create a copy of it. So this was the mask raster demo. So I talked about a lot of things and I only covered the main points. There's a lot more information you can get about the raster and imagery sections of the SDK. And I provided links here, and in case I'm going to upload these slides for you to access. But you can take pictures of this if you like, but the easiest way I found to get more information about the Pro SDK is open up your favorite browser. In the search engine, just type in ArcGIS Pro SDK. Oops. And basically the second link takes you to the GitHub page. The second link takes you to the GitHub page. And the GitHub page has a wiki section. And here is basically where you find all the information that you need. You can click on samples to access all the community samples. If you scroll down a little bit, you get different sections. One of the sections is Raster. And that takes you to the snippets and concepts sections of the Raster SDK. You'll also find samples in the map authoring section, and that has the samples for dealing with the visualizing aspect, adding raster data as layers and working with layers. So that's under samples. You can find most of our samples in raster, but also under map authoring. The first one is called adding a raster layer, that teaches you how to add raster layers. And there's one for working with raster layers, which teaches you about colorizers as well. So before I start, actually, let's summarize. So what we talked about today was the functionality related to working with rasters and imagery in the Pro SDK for .NET. We talked about how you can add rasters as layers to your map. We talked about how you can use colorizers to control how these rasters are displayed. We talked about how you can get and set processing templates to control how the raster data is processed. Then we went on to a finer grained API, which basically allows you to work with imagery directly instead of creating a layer by using the raster dataset object, creating an in-memory raster from it, getting pixels from that raster, changing it, and also you have the ability to transform ground coordinates to image coordinates as well. We saw a demo which uses this functionality to mask a section of the image that you pick. And we talked about how you can find more information about the imagery and raster sections of the SDK. So before I conclude, I'd just like to point out that the ArcGIS Pro SDK being so fundamentally different from ArcObjects, the way we prioritize things that we want to put in next is all based on your feedback. So please, we have multiple ways for you to contact us and let us know what you would like to see in the Pro SDK. And please use those and let us know what's missing, what you're trying to do. Maybe we can help. There's something already there. We've got GeoNet, we've got tech support. You can contact us at our conferences. And please use those methods and let us know what functionality you're looking for, because that helps us to prioritize basically what functionality is coming in the SDK. But yeah, that's it from me. Any questions? Great, thank you very much.